let's talk about everything I read in the month of July. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are talking about every single thing that I read in the month of July, and I seem to be alternating between lesser reading months and greater reading months, and we are in a greater reading month type of month. I read 18 books this month. These are just all the books that I had physical copies of that I wanted to show you, but I will talk about everything that I read. First and foremost, let's get into our statistics. So if there are any statistics that I don't mention in this video that you want to know more about either this month in my reading or for future months, then just let me know down below and I'll make sure to let you know. So I already mentioned I read 18 books total in the month, which is a lot. That's kind of like where my reading maxes out. Sorry if you can hear Alfred. He's got a little bell on his collar and he is repositioning himself over there. In total, I read 14 books on audio, which is a lot. It's a little bit more than I usually do. I only read 2 ebooks, but they were massive. I wonder which ones they were. And I read 2 books physically. So as far as percentage wise, this isn't too far off from my normal distribution of format of reading. I was able to get 8 books off of my physical TBR shelf. Right here, you can see them, which feels really good. Last month, my focus was to get books off my TBR, so I only had a couple books that were not in my stack, which was really satisfying. I'm feeling like maybe in August, I might focus more on getting things off of my physical TBR, because I would love to make some more space on that shelf, but we'll talk about that later. As far as when these books were published, I tend to read a lot of books that were published recently, as well as books that were published previously, kind of like an interesting mix. Though this month, I didn't read any books that were published last year, which was kind of interesting. 7 of the books that I read were published in 2024, and that makes 11 books that were published before 2023. And actually, the oldest book that I read this month was published in 1990. The one book was written in 1974, but not published till 2017. So I had a couple older books in my lineup, which was fun, but also a lot of like backlist books that I was trying to get through. And then my 100th book of the year was actually during the month of July. We'll talk about that when I get to that book in my book by book review. That was really exciting to be able to hit that mark. I'm not aiming for a specific number of books read this year. I'm just reading as much as I want to read, and we'll see where I end up. Last year, I read 125 books. And this year, I think I will definitely surpass that. And then as far as a breakdown of different genres, I read 1 nonfiction. I read 8 fantasy, which is pretty on par for me. I tend to read a lot of fantasy. I read 3 like general fiction type of books. I read 3 romances, 1 historical fiction, 1 sci-fi, and 1 horror novel. I tend to enjoy books in every genre, but there are certain genres I read a lot more of, as you can see from my layout there. Okay, with all those stats out of the way, let's jump into the books that I read and I'll give you my review about them. I just realized that I forgot the very first book that I finished in the month. It is The Sock Project by Summer Lee, and I'm including this in the video and I'm including it in my count because I actually did read it beginning to end, and I was reading this book as part of my Discord book club for Yarny related books. If you want to join my Discord, check it out down below. I also finished a book this month for the Discord that I was able to listen to on audio. So we'll talk about that later. I just finished that one. But every month or two, I try to pick a book that is related to the fiber arts that I can read with the people on my Discord channel and we can discuss it. I feel like having a nonfiction like a pattern book, there wasn't as much to discuss, so we tried reading a novel this month. But the Sock Project is a really good resource if you are a knitter, and if you are a beginner sock knitter, you want to knit your first pair of socks, or whether you have more experience, I feel like this is a good resource for you. I rated it a 4.5 star. It was funny. You could definitely read Summer's voice in it. And there were some interesting tips and tricks, though as someone who's knit dozens of pairs of socks, these patterns were in the realm of really beginner friendly to like maybe something interesting that a seasoned sock knitter would still enjoy to make, but is not super difficult to do. So this is a very attainable skill level across the board, even the more difficult patterns like color work, for example. I also feel like while the tips and tricks were really helpful as someone who's knit so many socks before, there wasn't really that much new information that I was able to glean from reading this book. Though if you have knit only like 10 pairs of socks, even though that sounds like a lot, even if you've only knit 10 or 12 pairs of socks, you would probably learn a lot from the tips that Summer shares because she has a lot of sock knitting experience. All that to say, I really recommend this book if you are a knitter and want to delve into the world of socks, or you want to strengthen your skills of sock knitting and really learn a lot from someone who I would consider an expert in the sock knitting world. I just realized that my stack is upside down, so I'm going to rearrange it so it's easier for me to pull off the books that I talk about. Okay, books are in easy to grab order. The next book that I read in the month of July was Can't Spell Treason Without T by Rebecca Thorne. And this book was originally published in 2022, independently published. And then it was picked up by a traditional publisher and published this year with these beautiful, like tealy blue sprayed edges. Super cute. So I had heard about this book before, and I can't remember which YouTuber mentioned it, but they had read the indie published version, and I hadn't realized that this was going to be traditionally published. And when I saw it in the store, I was like, oh yes, I've been wanting to read that. Let me just grab that. And it was really cute. It was really cozy. It is a gently sapphic romance. The characters are both female and they are starting out in kind of like the next season of their relationship together. So these two characters, Raina and Kian, want to start a new life together. They've been dating long distance and they're just ready to move on to the next season of their relationship together. They want to move away to somewhere far from the kingdom because the queen is very cruel and is Raina's boss because Raina's one of her guards. So you hear the story about how Raina escapes the palace, meets up with Kian, and then they travel to a remote area to have a bookshop. You get to see like the queen's guards trying to come after them. You get to see them dealing with dragons in this little like mountain village, and you get to see their relationships blossom with the people in this little community as they are becoming part of it. This is a cozy fantasy for sure, and I do really like cozy fantasy, but it's hard for me not to compare this to Legends and Lattes and to Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldry, and this was just not quite the right balance for me of like cozy slice of life type of vibes and like higher stakes, high fantasy happenings. I still really enjoyed this book. I rated it a 4-star, but I didn't feel like the balance in like tone was exactly right. I felt like a lot of their slice of life conversations were revolved around the relationship as they were navigating things, and it kind of felt a little stale. Like they kept talking about the same arguments and like getting to know yous that they had been the whole rest of the book. And then the fantasy portion felt really high stakes with dragons and huge injuries and like really big things like imminent capture from the queen and like stuff like that. That was just the balance between the cozy and the fantasy was not my ideal cup of tea. But this was a really cute book, really cozy, and I'm really interested in reading the next books. I think the second book has already been published independently, and it will be republished later on this year with some fun sprayed edges through a traditional publisher. And then I think she's working on the third book. I don't think the third book in the series has been published at all at this point. So I'm really excited to continue on the series, get to know these characters more, because their relationship was like healthy and sweet, but also felt a little like stale and not super deep. But part of that is because this was like the first time that they had living together and like really investing in their relationship and not making it secondary to like their careers. I found it interesting. I did really enjoy it. Not my favorite cozy fantasy, but definitely one I would recommend. The next book that I read was also an audiobook. I don't think I mentioned, but the book by Rebecca Thorne, I did that on audio. And then this one I also did on audio, A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir. This is the second book in the An Ember in the Ashes series. And ooh, like emotionally, this hits. I love how her writing is so poignant and powerful. I feel like I know these characters so well. I love the nuances and the turmoil that these characters face as they're navigating this world. They aren't perfect characters, but you can really feel for them and the choices that they are trying to make as they're trying to figure out the best way to move forward in this fantasy world with martial law and some really cruel characters that are in the mix. You get some really interesting and really unexpected plot twists that also feel really appropriate. I guess they really fit in with the characters and what you know of the characters. So it wasn't just like plot twists to like shake things up a bit, but it felt almost like real life, even though this is a fantasy world. I love this series. It is emotionally fraught, and so I can only do so much at once. I am currently listening to the third book in the series. It's a 4-book series, and I think there's a companion series coming out by Sabaa Tahir. Air is coming out in a couple months, and I think it might follow like the next generation from this world, but I'm not quite sure. So I really want to finish this series before Air comes out so I can read that when it is a new release. I keep having to push my glasses up because they keep sliding down. Anyway, 5 out of 5 stars. I love this series. I love these books, but my heart is like aching. And part of me wants to just stop reading and like read some happy stuff. But part of me feels like I can't leave these characters hanging in the balance. I need to keep going. The next book that I read was another audiobook, but not one I have on my bookshelf. This is Studies at the School by the Sea by Jenny Colgan, and this is the long-awaited for 4th book in the School by the Sea series. This follows Maggie Adair, who is a teacher from Scotland, and she is working at a very posh boarding school. And through the series, you follow some of her students and their navigating teenage years, as well as following her and her relationships as she's kind of navigating what she wants out of life. This book, I had high expectations because I really wanted to see some conclusion in that storyline of her relationship, but I just felt really unsatisfied. It felt like they were having the same issues again and again. There wasn't really growth in their relationship, so it felt kind of stagnant. And honestly, in these books, the thing I love the most is reading about the teenagers and like the problems that they're facing and the way they're navigating it. I just feel like those characters are really colorful and really fun to see their storylines play out. And I would say that I did enjoy that storyline better than Maggie's storyline, but I also felt like that storyline didn't have as much depth and complexity that it has had in previous books. I know people are saying that they like this book the most out of the series because it is more modern compared to the other 3 books, but I was not feeling it. It wasn't what I was hoping for in a potential conclusion for this series. I just felt like we got a lot of attention from Fliss and her perspective, but we didn't really see Simone's tale, or there's a couple other girls that we just didn't hear a lot from. So even though I did like the teenagers' story better, we didn't get as much of it complexity-wise as we had in previous books. And I was a little bit disappointed. So I only rated this a 3-star. I think it's my least favorite of the series just because I had such high expectations that things would get wrapped up and like progress really well. And they just felt really stagnant, like I said. The next book that I read was actually a physical book that I read in a vlog that has already been uploaded on this channel. It is my vlog for Woolbury Fiber Cove's Summer Book Society box. And in that box, I received Mrs. Quinn's Rise to Fame by Olivia Ford, and I read this book this month, and I really enjoyed it. Honestly, this was not a book I'd ever thought about or seen. It was not on my radar at all, and so I was really surprised to see this in the box because I had 0 expectations, and I really enjoyed it. It is about an elderly person who is applying to be on the reality show Britain Bakes, which is basically like the Great British Bake Off. And you see both flashbacks from her life previously, and there's a secret from her past life that even her husband of 60 years doesn't know. And you're also seeing the current timeline of her doing all this baking, trying to get on this show, and then also competing. Also, even the aftermath of it. So the pacing was interesting as far as the climax of the story not being like the conclusion of the baking show, but the climax of the story happened afterwards and was more related to the secret that she had kept for decades. This book is an atmospheric general fiction book. If you like to bake, I think you'd really enjoy reading some of these descriptions as you're really immersed in her experience baking different things. It even inspired me to do some baking, and I don't do that very often. There are also a couple really simple recipes at the end of the book which are fun to try out. I definitely recommend that you check out my vlog where I talk talk a little bit more in depth about my experience reading through this book, as well as opening all the goodies from the box that I purchased from Wilbury Fiber Co. So make sure to check that out up above and down below. All in all, a good read, a cozy read, not my favorite type of story, but I could definitely see how some people would absolutely adore this, and I hope to share this one with my mother-in-law. Oh boy. The next book I listened on audio, probably my least favorite of the month. The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han. Now this is YA. I knew that going in, but I read To All the Boys I've Loved Before. I read that whole series and I really enjoyed it as far as like a YA series goes. It was just fun, a little bit dramatic, felt very realistic as far as like a high school romance goes. But this book was lacking a lot. I read another reviewer that said it was hot garbage, and I kind of agree. There were some summer vibes, which were nice, but the characters lacked depth. Their personalities were all very, very shallow. I really hated how all these characters interacted with one another. I felt like the main girl character, Belly, or Isabel, was really super whiny and very immature. She acted like she was 11 or 12, not 16. I just like could not get into it. Like I didn't understand the story plot, why the story was going where it was going. There was no depth of characters. There was no character growth. The actual storytelling of this story was very poor. And I don't have a desire to continue on in this series to see what happens with these characters. I'm not invested at all. This story, if you haven't read it before, is about two families that meet up at a beach house that one of the families owns, and they do this every single summer. You see a couple little flashbacks from earlier years, but this specific summer, Belly is 16, her brother's going off to college really soon, so he has just a really brief stay at the beach house. Her mom's there, and then this other family is a mother, and then her two boys that are like 18 and 16, just about the same age as the other kids. And they're spending the summer together, but they're all kind of growing up and things are changing. She's always had a crush on one of the boys, but the other boy has always been a lot nicer and more of a friend to her. So it's an interesting dynamic, but I honestly don't like love triangles in YA books. They feel really shallow and insubstantial and kind of pointless. Like, why do you like both of these guys? I see no personality traits whatsoever from either of them that would make you want them. Anyway, that's my own thing. So I was curious about buying the books, so I decided to listen to one just to see. And I'm very glad I didn't buy the books because they're not well written. But some people love them because they're nostalgic, teenage, first love type of vibes, but not for me. Not this iteration of first summer love teenage vibes. Not my favorite. 2 stars. The next book that I read was also an audiobook. This was Geekerella by Ashley Poston, and I have read one of her adult romances, The Dead Romantics, and I really enjoyed it. So I was interested in seeing this YA novel that was written before her adult romances. And while this had a really, really slow start that I had a hard time getting into it, I did really enjoy this. It's basically a Cinderella retelling. This girl lives with her stepmom and her stepsisters because her father has since passed away, and they treat her horribly. Honestly, it's abuse. And that was part of the reason I had a hard time reading the beginning of this book, because it was just so icky. I really did not enjoy reading about the ways that her stepsisters and her stepmother treated her. Very Cinderella coded on purpose, right? And so you hear from her perspective as well as the perspective of this 18-year-old guy who has just been cast to be the lead in a reboot of a really niche like sci-fi show from like 20, 30 years ago. They're doing a movie reboot, and he is cast as the main character, and he is a big nerd, but it's not fitting for his image, so he kind of has to hide that he's a big nerd for this like Star Trek-esque type of series. I can't remember what it's called. I do remember that they were on the spaceship Prospero. I really love that this whole fandom world was created by Ashley. There were a ton of details about the different episodes. Oh my gosh, this is like a Galaxy Quest book. Have you seen Galaxy Quest? I love that movie, but it felt very similar as far as it's this niche fandom that people are still obsessed with decades later, and there were interesting aliens. There were different episodes that the fans like could point out, like in episode 16 such and such a thing happened. All of those little details really added up to a really awesome picture of what this TV show originally looked like. And it was just really cool. As someone who is kind of a nerd, I really enjoyed learning about this fake TV series. And I wish I could watch it. That would be so cool. But the female main character is a huge fan of this show. She has her own blog about it. She is not happy about the casting and she complains about it on her blog. And you follow the story as these two lives come together, as they have an accidental contact but don't know who each other are, and they kind of build a relationship that way as they go to a convention. It's just really awesome. If you love sci-fi fandoms, if you love conventions like a Comic-Con or like a sci-fi convention, I think you would really enjoy the atmosphere of this book. It is very cheesy. It is a YA romance, but I definitely enjoyed it. It just was really slow to start. I rated this a 4-star. The next book I want to talk about is one that I read on audio. It's a pretty quick novella. You're kind of dropped in the middle of the action, and I feel like I would really benefit from rereading it, so I might buy a copy or maybe get a physical copy from my library to reread it, because I feel like I could pick up a lot more on this story if I read it again. This is When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, and this is an urban fantasy set in a parallel universe type of Chicago where there are like demons and witches and other like magical type of creatures from Polish folklore that are intermixed in like Chicago society. And so you're following multiple characters in this kind of situation as one of the characters is trying to find Baba Yaga. He's earned a magical flower and he's looking for someone to help him find Baba Yaga. We don't know a lot about what's going on. And a lot of people have said this book is better if you don't have any expectations for it, which I would maybe say yes, but I also feel like I wish this book was longer because like I said, you get dropped right into the action. There's so many different mystical characters that it is kind of hard to follow exactly what's happening. And it is kind of action-packed. And so it was almost too fast of a novella read. I kind of wish it was either a little bit longer, there was a little bit more backstory, things like that that could have helped my reading experience. I still rated it a 4. It's beautifully written, had some really deep musings that were included in like how the characters interacted. And I really love learning about this Polish folklore, but I want more. And I feel like if there was more to this story, I would like this book even more. I may get a copy to reread it. Maybe I'll get more out of it. I'm not sure. You'll have to see in a later video if I do end up rereading it this year. I haven't touched this pile in a while. I've got another book on audio that I listened to, and there is also a vlog about this book that I am currently working on. It probably won't be out yet, but I'll make sure to link it down below, and I'll try up above too when I get a chance. For this vlog, this is Yarnaceous Fiber's book box that they do every other month. And this very last book box was for Dragon Teeth by Michael Crichton. And I finally learned how to say his last name. It's not Crichton, it's not Crichton, it's Crichton. Sure, it's Michael Crichton. That's what his wife said. I listened to her say his name. Dragon Teeth was written in 1974, but published posthumously in 2017. So it was published after Crichton had already passed away. It was found amongst his papers and manuscripts and things. I don't know why this book had been set aside and not published sooner. I don't know what edits he would have liked to make or what things he wanted to continue to work on a little bit more in this story. I honestly really enjoyed it. I rated it a 4-star. I loved the historical fiction aspect. Basically, the first half of the book is about these two paleontologists in the 1800s, Cope and Marsh, and the Bone Wars, which is an actual time period that happened in paleontology when we didn't have a lot of knowledge about dinosaur fossils, and we only had like maybe 9 dinosaurs that we knew about. And so there was a couple decades where these two paleontologists went like full out and we're trying to get as many dinosaur fossils as possible, to name as many dinosaurs as possible, to leave the biggest impact on paleontology. This actually happened. I feel like Crichton did a really good job at portraying these two different personalities and their impact on the world. It was really fascinating to see it through the lens of this novel, and I feel like I definitely learned a lot about this time period that I didn't really know a lot about. So that was kind of the first half of this book. The second half was like a Wild West story in this itty-bitty settlement in like Wyoming maybe, or Nebraska. I can't exactly remember where. It was Deadwood. and this little itty bitty settlement that hadn't even been around for like a year, and this main character, William Johnson, trying to navigate being in this Wild West scenario and trying to get out of there with like fighting the winter and things like that. So it took a turn that I was not anticipating. I will say I don't really like the stress and high stakes involved with like a Wild West type of a story, so that wasn't my favorite. It was very perilous times, and that was very stressful to read about, especially compared to the first half of the book. But I do feel like I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed this writing style, so much so that I read another book by Michael Crichton this past month that I'll talk about in a minute. I can definitely see how this book is not quite finished. It was a little bit on the shorter side. I feel like some of the character arcs and conclusions of the story could have been more fleshed out. I could definitely see how there could be a little bit of changing with the pacing between the first half and the second half of the book. But overall, I still felt like this was a really polished draft and was not too far off from being a published book on its own. I just don't know why Crichton left it. It's very fascinating. I wish we heard more about his reasons why he set this manuscript aside. But I'm really glad that it was published because I enjoyed myself, and I never would have picked up this book except for that book box by Yarnaceous Fibers. And so if you want to learn more about this book as well as the book box, make sure to check out the link down below and up above once that video has been posted later on in the month of August. The next audiobook that I read was The Paradise Problem by Christina Lauren, and I had meant to read this earlier. Christina Lauren is an author duo that writes a lot of romance novels. They were coming to Salt Lake City, and I was hoping to read this book before they came, and I didn't quite get to it. It's fine. I still read it, and I loved it. I rated this a 4.5 star. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. This was a marriage and convenience kind of fake dating scenario that was very unexpected, that was really funny, and took a lot of like little turns that just like made me laugh out loud. I really loved these two characters, and I really loved the way they interacted and their dynamics, especially as their relationship began to grow and blossom. Basically, the female main character and the main male character have a marriage of convenience while they're in school. They part ways, but they haven't actually been divorced because she didn't read the paperwork she signed. She thinks they're divorced, but they're not. He comes back to her a few years later, says, I need your help because I need to show my wife to my family, and there's like an inheritance at risk, all sorts of things, because he is loaded. His parents are super loaded. They're very, very rich. And so you get a lot of rich people drama, and you get to see all the different members of this family and their response to being insanely rich, which I really like. It didn't feel like all the side characters were exactly the same person. They felt all very distinct, but all of them had been impacted by this wealth. And so even though it was a little bit ridiculous, it also felt very realistic. Like if I had to imagine what it would be like to be at a wedding with all of these rich family members, I could get behind what Christina Lauren were talking about. So I really enjoyed this book. I plan to purchase this book, but I'll probably wait till it comes out in paperback next year or so. Now we have come to my tandem read on my ebook of Empire Storms and Tower of Dawn. Oh boy, this is like 13 or 1400 pages combined. It took forever, like a couple months to get through this, but I definitely tried to power through in the month of July, and I tried to do a lot of reading, like hundreds of pages this month. And I'm really proud that I finally finished, because now I am on Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. I'm really excited for this series to come to a conclusion, but I'm also very scared. The first book I ended up actually finishing was Empire Storms, which technically comes first in this series. This is following Aelin and all of her compatriots in their main continent as they're trying to, oh man, how do I not give spoilers? They're traveling all around. Storylines are coming together from different people. They're kind of all joining up. You know, you can see all these storylines coming together for like the final battle in Kingdom of Ash, right? I really liked this book. I rated it a 4.75 star. The only thing that like kind of put me off a little bit is that it felt like everyone was going to be partnered up. I love having romance in my fantasy, but for some reason it just felt like everybody was fitting together a little too nicely. Like, it's totally okay for someone to be really awesome and cool and tough and like an integral part of the team and not have a life partner. And I wish there was some examples of that 2 in the book, if that makes sense. But I'm really impressed with Aylin's character growth throughout this book and like the way that the plot moved forward throughout this book. It's a long one, but I enjoyed it. And then for Tower of Dawn, I was not looking forward to this. So I'm actually really glad that I did the tandem read because it meant I was kind of alternating chapters. I just followed some random tandem I just followed a random tandem list online for like how to read, intersperse these chapters kind of in the same timeline because they happen at the same time but in different continents. And that really helped me get started on this because I hated Kale before I read this book. I really did not like him and I was not excited to read a whole entire book about his story because I did not feel sorry for him at all. But you know what? This book made me like Kale again. I feel for him. His character is a lot more nuanced and complex than you see in the other books because you get to really see inside his brain because he's a very broody character. And so if you don't see inside his brain, you don't know all that's going on. And so I feel like this book gave Kale a really interesting redemption arc. Honestly, I enjoyed this book more. It was a little bit slower, but I was thoroughly invested in everyone's timelines within this book. There were multiple perspectives going on. You get introduced to some characters, some that you've never met before, but you really, really love. Some that you may have had glimpses of, like in the Assassin's Blade. And you're really happy to see them show up again and see how their character has grown in the past few years. I loved everything about this book, and it had so much more depth than I anticipated. It definitely contributed to the main plot of the story, but it also kind of felt like a side quest. This book ends very hopefully though. This book ends tragically and like all hope is gone. So what I would recommend, if you don't want to read these in tandem, that you read Tower of Dawn first and then you read Empire of Storms, so then you're ready to go right into Kingdom of Ash. Because the pacing between this book and this book, you shouldn't read Empire of Storms and then slow down for Tower of Dawn and then speed back up again for Kingdom of Ash. It just doesn't fit very well. So I would do Tower of Dawn first. And it honestly felt so long reading them in tandem. I don't think I would do it again. I thought that it would matter more chronologically, like what happened in either of the books, but there were only a couple instances where Kale learns about something that happened in Empire of Storms. It just was like a couple brief blips and it didn't make too much of a difference. So next time I don't think I would read them in tandem just because it was a lot of work switching back and forth. And then sometimes I forgot like which book I was reading last and what chapter I was on. And also it'd be like, oh, it's been a couple weeks since I've read from Tower of Dawn because I've read a few chapters of Empire of Storms and I'm just going slow kind of thing. So that's what I would recommend, but 4.75 star, 5 star. Did not see that one coming. The next book that I read was Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. And like I mentioned, I enjoyed his writing in Dragon Teeth and I wanted to read Jurassic Park. And I read it as part of my Yarnaceous Fibers book box video because I still had a lot of knitting to do. And I figured might as well keep on the Michael Crichton train and keep reading one of his stories. One thing about Dragon Teeth, I thought it would be more related to like Jurassic Park and dinosaurs, but it was very much historical fiction based rather than like sci-fi based. That's okay. But I really liked how Jurassic Park at the very beginning talked about Marsh and Cope and the Bone Wars. And so that was like a really fun Easter egg and that I already had learned about that scenario. And so it wasn't like new information. It was just kind of like reorienting myself to that history of paleontology, which is really cool. I loved Jurassic Park. I don't know if I ever would have read this. Probably maybe someday, but I never would have thought to read it except for the book box from Yarnaceous Fibers. And I'm so glad I did. I loved it. It was published in 1990. So again, one of the oldest books that I read this month. The oldest published book, but not the oldest written book, if that makes sense. And this is a sci-fi thriller. It's not a modern day thriller. Like it was published, what, 24 years ago. So it's slower than modern thrillers, but there's a sense of dread and unease and suspense that kind of builds up throughout the entire story, which I really, really loved. I also found the characters interesting and I really liked seeing their interactions and like what they contributed to the conversations and the dynamics of the group. Though I feel like some characters were killed off a little bit earlier than I would have liked, but I did like that like not everyone made it out alive. It made it very realistic. And the science behind Jurassic Park, I already knew because I've seen the movies, but I just really appreciated the depth of that science and it felt really believable for me. Granted, I'm not like a genetic biologist or anything, so I'm sure they would have something to say about it, but I found from my perspective, it felt really realistic. I did feel like Malcolm's philosophizing on chaos theory and even like the ethical impact of scientific discoveries and like who is responsible for the unintended consequences of scientific discoveries. That whole conversation was really interesting, but felt a little bit like overdone, a little bit excessive. I was like, okay, yeah, I get the point. You can move on now. And it just kept going. So that's one reason this wasn't a 5-star for me. Another reason was Lex. She was so annoying. I really wanted her to die, like the entire book. She made me very angry. If Lex had not been as annoying, then I probably would have liked this book more. Honestly, she was too annoying. That sounds so bad because she was like 8 years old, but I genuinely wanted her to just die and disappear from the book. I like wanted her not there at all. All that being said, I really enjoyed this book and I'm looking forward to reading The Lost World. I've got this on audio from my library, and so I hopefully will be reading that in August. The next book we have, I read on audio, but I got a book off my physical TBR, which is great. This is Legendary by Stephanie Garber. This is the second book in the Caraval series. This is YA. It is fantasy with some sinister magical elements like drinking blood, giving up days of your life for like secrets and things like that that are definitely more sinister. This book specifically is following Donatella, Scarlett's younger sister, as she is trying to find out Legend's real name. And as she is trying to kind of balance the bargains that she has made with Legend and with another character that you'll meet in this book as she's trying to navigate. There's also another series of Caraval because Empress Elentine is celebrating a birthday, and so they have Caraval again so soon after the first Caraval. So you get to see more of the Caraval magic. I really liked Donatella as a character. I liked her more than Scarlett, and I really liked where the plot was going as far as how her decisions from the first book were impacting what was happening in the second book. And I really like the introduction of the fates you get to hear about. I think they're mentioned briefly in Caraval, but you hear a lot more about them in Legendary and even in the third book that I'll mention in just a minute. I really liked the progression of the story. It didn't feel like middle book syndrome at all. I enjoyed this book the most out of the series, I think, though I feel like the sinister, magical Caraval elements, you definitely still had all that sinister magic, but the magic of Caraval specifically was more muted in this story. But that makes sense because Donatella's storyline isn't as engrossed in Caraval as it is in the other problems going on that are influencing Caraval. Take that how you will, but I was missing a little bit of that Caraval specific magic, but you still got a lot of magic. You got some sinister things that happened as she's trying to figure out how to navigate this, and you find out who Legend is, which is fun. I really enjoyed this. 4.5 star. Definitely not a perfect book, but for a YA fantasy that has some unique elements that I haven't seen in other books, I really enjoy reading this series. And then I had to take a break because I was waiting for my hold for my library for the third book. So I read A Storybook Wedding by K.J. Micciche. And this is a romance that I had just seen from my library, and I decided to pick it up and see how I liked it. I rated this a 3.25 star. It was a alright romance. It was a good romance, but definitely not a great romance and not a perfect romance for me. This follows CJ, who is a children's librarian, and she wants to become a writer really, really badly. And then you also follow Nate Ellis, who is a writer. He has like a one-hit wonder, serendipitous timing of when his book was published just prior to the pandemic. Things worked out really well for him. He's rich and famous, but also in a writer's block. So you follow these two as they go to an MFA program. He's a professor and he kind of wants a writing atmosphere to like work on his next book. And she wants to get her MFA in writing so she can prepare her first manuscript and hopefully be a published author. And you see how they interact, become friends, and then have a marriage of convenience because of a compromising situation they were placed in. I'm not new to the whole marriage of convenience because of a scandalous scenario type of thing. I mean, that's pretty common in like a Regency era romance. It just hits different in modern books, and I just did not like that dynamic. I felt like the reasoning behind the marriage of convenience was really shallow, and the conflict that they were trying to resolve through the marriage of convenience was pretty minimal, honestly, and they didn't even try to like resolve it any other way, if that makes any sense. It felt very flat as far as like a marriage of convenience for me personally. And while I really loved the humor of this book, and especially CJ, her character is freaking hilarious. It was so funny. I also felt kind of cringy about a lot of the things that she said. Like, she's 29, I am 29, and I'm not super in touch with pop culture. Why would you, in an effort to break the ice with a 22-year-old seeking an MFA, why would you ask them about One Direction, and why would you talk about Jersey Shore? Those are like way out of touch. The character was sometimes written like a 45-year-old female and not a 29-year-old female. And it just was very cringy, and it was very far off. It was very cringy. I almost DNF'd this book because I was so cringed out by her, even though I found her hilarious, but I persevered, and the cringe got better throughout the book. And I really like Nate too, but he was also not a super in-depth character. I would have loved a little bit more depth from him. This was a cheesy romance that had a grand gesture at the end that was really cute, but also didn't feel super in tune with what the characters would have chosen to do. And the characters both made some really stupid decisions, not just the marriage of convenience in general, but they made some stupid decisions throughout the story that just made me like cringe and like, ugh. Knowing that things would not turn out well for them because of their decisions. Overall, this was a good romance. I didn't have any like huge issues with it. I would probably read from this author again, but this didn't feel like my perfect romance by any means. The next book that I read, getting it off my physical TBR, What Feast at Night by T. Kingfisher. I did the audiobook for this like I did for the first book in the series. This is the second book in the Sworn Soldier series. You're following, what's their name? Alex Easton, who is a non-binary character in this like 1800s time period. It doesn't even say, I can't remember. Anyway, it's like 1800s time period. They were a soldier, and so the role of soldier was superimposed, if that makes sense, on their gender. So it's a very interesting character, and in this story, you are following them as they retreat to their hunting lodge to kind of recuperate after the events of the first book, because they almost died from fungi, and that was not cool. So they're kind of recuperating with their valet, and Miss Potter comes and spends some time with them as well. But you come to find out that there's like this weird, maybe an illness going around where people can't breathe, and there's this folklorish creature that like will sit on your chest at night and make it so you can't breathe. And so as they're learning more about this, they're trying to like stay safe and not succumb to this creature, which is really cool. It's a novella, it's nice and short. I enjoyed this book. I feel like the horror elements were not as horrific as the first book in the series, but I did really enjoy like the pacing of this book. It had a really good beginning, middle, end. I feel like T. Kingfisher does a really good job at writing novellas. And for some reason, I felt like the storyline for this book was more cohesive than the first book a little bit. So I rated it 4.25 star, the same as the last book, because there were some things that I felt like were a little better, some things that I felt like were not as good. For me personally, I really wanted more horror, honestly, but I still really enjoy this book. And this cover is just so gruesome. My phone battery is dying, so we gotta hurry this up. The next book that I listened to was the book that we read for my Discord book club this month, and it is The Vampire Knitting Club. This is the long-standing series by Nancy Warren. There are over a dozen books that I know of. And so if you really like this kind of cozy paranormal mystery romance type of story, then you might really enjoy these books. I rated this book a 2.5 star. It was nothing special. I still finished it. I guess I kind of might have enjoyed it, but mostly I just felt indifferent about this book. The character felt very bland and personalityless. And it also felt like sometimes she was overly trusting of people and sometimes she didn't trust them at all. There's vampires in this story. There's also witches in the story, but I didn't get enough vampire or witchy elements or vibes out of this type of a book. Like if I want to read like a paranormal or like a spooky story, I want more vibes, and I was just missing those vibes from this book. You can definitely see that this is more romance heavy. Like she's looking at all the guys around her and commenting on how attractive they are, and there's already kind of a love triangle starting to form, and like two characters that are showing their masculinity to try to like make a good impression on her and scare the other guy away. They're both interested. Kind of a weird dynamic, like not my favorite. In general, this was a fine book, but I feel like very mediocre as far as like the writing goes, and there wasn't a lot of depth in the characters like I wanted there to be. One of the members of my book club said that they like to listen to the Vampire Knitting Club series while they're knitting or crocheting, and it's just something like kind of mindless to have on in the background while they are doing their stitching, and I could definitely see that. The last book that I have finished in the month of July is Finale by Stephanie Garber. I finally got my Holden. I was so excited. I rated this a 4.25 star. I enjoyed this book a lot, and I've enjoyed the series a lot. Definitely has that sinister magic going on. It completely steps away from Caraval, and so I guess my expectations were different for this book compared to the last book that involved Caraval. This book did not involve Caraval at all, but it was very heavy on the Fates and in their interactions with each other and with the main characters and with the people in this empire, which was really fascinating. I love learning more about the Fates, but I didn't like as much that this book addresses both love triangles, the previous books. They're still going on, and I'm like, can we just decide which one we're going for? Because I know who's going to win out on both love triangles. Can we just get there? It felt a little bit tedious, and it was so romance heavy, the first part of this book. But then as things got more sinister, the Fates got more interaction with the characters, it moved away from like the romance heavy focus and was definitely more fantasy focused, which I liked a lot more. This is a really good ending to the series, and it also leaves a lot of room for Stephanie Garber to expand on this world as far as a preamble to Legends story, some more information about the Fates, either beforehand or after the events of this book, which is, I think, the next series, the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. It follows Jax after this series takes place. So I'm really excited to continue reading books in this world, and I really hope that Stephanie Garber continues to write books in this world as well. And there's like a Yule, Christmas, holiday type of novella coming out called Spectacular, I think, in October. So I'm really excited. I finished the series so I can pick up that book when it is released. Whew! Those are all 18 books that I read in the month of July. I haven't thought too much about my TBR for the month of August. I have like a few things that are on my brain, but I will talk about all the books that I have started already that I should be finishing in the month. My current ebook is Kingdom of Ash. I am literally on chapter 1. I've read like a couple of the little like preamble chapters. So what page is this even? Oh, I'm on page 9. I've just been really tired at bedtime, so I haven't made good progress on this yet, but it is 980 pages. I'm excited to dive in, and this will take me a while. I honestly don't know if I'll finish it in August or if I'll finish it later in the year. And then I already mentioned one of my audiobooks I'm listening to, A Reaper at the Gates by Sabaa Tahir. This is the 3rd book in the An Ember in the Ashes series. I am about 15% of the way done. I did take a break. I had some other loans coming up for return earlier from my Libby app, and so currently I'm reading The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley, I think is her name. I'm about halfway through. I'm liking it okay. It'll probably be in the 3-star realm unless something crazy happens. It's very slow. It's not exactly what I was hoping for from a time travel romance type of book. Not bad. Some people are really, really loving it. I just think it's not quite what I was looking for. Those are my 2 audiobooks that I'm currently listening to. And then I've got a few physical books that I have started and I've not made a lot of progress on, actually. This is Network Effect by Martha Wells. This is the first full-length novel in the Murderbot series. So there are 4 novellas and then this book, and I think there's another novella or 2 and then another book, something like that. So I'm about halfway through the series. I am like 2 or 3 chapters in, not very far. I have a ways to go. I tried listening to the audiobook of this and I really didn't like the narrator. It was just so different than how my brain was narrating for the novellas that I read physically that I decided I'm not gonna do the audiobook, I'll just read it physically. And I'm just making my way slowly through it. I'm also reading Mixed Signals by B.K. Borison. This is part of my 24 books to read in 2024 for my TBR that I'm trying to prioritize. I have really enjoyed this book. It is so cute, but I am only like 50 pages in. I've got a ways to go. I will not finish it today, which is July 31st. This will definitely get finished in August though, because I do want to read Business Casual by B.K. Morrison coming up in the fall. This is like the summer book in that Love Light Farm series, so I want to stay on top of it. But this is between Layla and Caleb, and even though Layla hasn't ever noticed Caleb before, she's starting to notice that he's pretty cute, and it sounds like there'll be a fake dating scenario, which I am all for. And they just seem like the sweetest people. I'm really excited to see where this book goes. And then finally, I've got a nonfiction book that I want to read. This is not available on audio from Hoopla or from Libby, and so I have to read it physically. But this is called Not Just Jane by Shelley DeWeese, and this is about 7 women writers who transformed British literature who are not Jane Austen. And so I'm still in the introduction because the introduction is like 30 pages long, and it was just a little bit long to read. Like sometimes nonfiction is hard to read at bedtime. I am hopefully going to put some time into this when my brain is more awake, and I'm really excited to read more about some other British literature women authors. So those are all the books that I've started that I expect or hope to finish in the month of August, but you'll have to check in next month to see what I actually end up reading in the month of August. I do think I might do a reading vlog this month. Maybe another 24-hour romance readathon? Maybe. If we want that, let me know down below. Or if you have any other themes for like a readathon or a reading vlog, let me know what you would like to see, because I would love to hear. Now I guess it's time to organize my bookshelves and get back to reading. Until next time, happy reading. Bye!